I've been working on what became my Yancy content management system that I didn't realize I was building a content management system when I wrote it, but, well, time makes fools of us all. Working on it for a couple years now, mostly during the Mojolicious advent calendar as a thing. And I decided that it needed its own website. Not a big deal, just need something to, like introduce the project, like links to like the GitHub page, the Meta CPAN page, documentation. And last, to make it easy to maintain, I definitely wanted to make sure that I could export it as a static set of HTML files and just upload that to my server. So I didn't have to like keep a daemon running and maintain and have to like put monitoring. So I have to wake myself up in the middle of the night to restart a web server. I don't even like get paid for that at work anymore. So I could use one of those like fancy dancy static site generators that lets you like write markdown files and then it like processes them into HTML and uploads them for you. I even wrote one called Staticles, but I really kind of felt that it'd be nice for Yancy to be able to host its own website. So I can say that, hey, the content management system is good enough to run its own website. And by the time I was done, it was interesting in how easy the process was, and how well it kind of integrates with Mojolicious. So I get to basically explain how to do Mojolicious, while also ancillarily saying, here's this cool thing that I did. So I decided to make then a Yancy Markdown site. So before I can get started with this, I need to install some modules. Obviously, I'm going to need to use Mojolicious. And then I'm going to have to use Yancy for the content management. Yancy comes with Bootstrap, so I won't have to install that myself. For the UI library, I'll use that for styling. And I want to keep this really, really simple, so I'm going to use SQLite as a database. I can install all this from CPAN quite easily. With these installed, then I can start building a Mojolicious Lite application. First thing I need to do to start using Mojolicious is just import the Mojolicious Lite module. This is the easiest way to get started with Mojolicious, but if later I decide that my application has grown, there's actually a command that will take this Mojolicious Lite script and turn it into a Mojolicious module, which is kind of nice. Oops, I didn't turn off my notifications. After that, the next thing I really want to do is start building up my database schema. The first thing about any website is, what does my data look like, and then I can start displaying it. Before that, I need to be able to connect to a SQLite database. So I'm going to write a little helper that will get me a connection to a SQLite database. Helpers are little utility functions that are available throughout your Mojolicious site. So anywhere you are, when you're handling a request, you can get access to these little helpers. So I have to import the module, and then I'll say that I'm going to build a helper called DB, and that's going to be a subroutine reference. And then I get to use the state keyword of Perl 510, which is nice. But I'm going to create a variable that will hold my SQLite connection, and I'm just going to call it docs.db. And then I'm going to return that. So every time I call this helper, the first time I call it, it's going to instantiate this object, and every time I call it afterwards, it's going to return to me that same database object. Then I can write my schema. And Mojo SQLite has this fun thing called migrations, where you can write a SQL statement that will create your database. And as you change your database, you can write new migrations that will upgrade it through different versions. So to start out, I'm going to create version 1, and I say in order to go to version 1, up to version 1, what I need to do is I need to create table pages. My pages table is going to have a path, and it's going to have some markdown. And then it's going to have the result of that markdown as HTML. So here then is the SQL I need to do to create my my pages table. Then all I have to do is I tell my database object to migrate. So app is the Mojolicious application, DB is my helper, and then auto migrate is basically saying look for all the migrations you can find and look in the database and compare the two. If you've got new migrations, run them. So now then if I were to add a 2 up, I could create a new table, or I could alter my table, or I could even add data. So these kind of help organize my database upgrades. So now that I have a database schema, I can configure my content management system to be able to edit all this data. So Yancy is just going to provide the UI to allowing me to edit data in that table. So Yancy is a plugin for Mojolicious. So I tell Mojolicious I want to load the Yancy plugin. I have to give it my database connection. Yancy supports multiple backends, so I just have to tell it this is a SQLite database, and here's my Mojo SQLite object to use. And then I tell it to read my schema. And so what Yancy will do then is it will look at the SQLite schema and build a JSON schema and kind of figure out, okay, these columns exist, here are the types, and this is how I edit them. This feature took me a while, and I don't recommend anybody doing this, but I'm into it now, so I got to keep doing it. But reading a SQLite schema, you can't really get everything. So I do have to kind of tell it a couple more things here. So I'm going to tell it that in the pages table, the pages table consists of a bunch of properties. One of those columns is Markdown, and I'm going to tell Yancy that this is holding Markdown. And then I'm going to tell it that when you render the Markdown, you're going to store it in an HTML field called HTML. So this is what I did to be able to write Markdown in Yancy and then have it save HTML without, so it actually uses a JavaScript Markdown renderer to save it as HTML. So last, I need a way to display all of this data. To display content in Mojolicious, I create a route. Specifically, I want to create a GET route. That means if someone makes a GET request to my server, that this route can match. To find any page in the database, what I want to do is I use this placeholder thing here. So this /star ID means match everything after the slash and store that in the ID field. And then later, what I can do is I can look up that ID as the path of my page. So remember, I had that path column, and then the ID gets compared to the path and then shows my page. And we'll talk a little bit more about the stash later. After I configure the URL, I got to give it a destination. And there's a lot of ways to configure destinations in Mojolicious. If I wanted to, I could just give it a name. And then this would try to render a index.html template if it can find it. I could also give it a subroutine. And a subroutine would then allow me to use any kind of Perl code to write whatever I want. This is going to render some text, just say hello. But I can also write a controller class. A controller is the C in the model view controller pattern, MVC pattern. And the controller lets me move that subroutine, that rendering code, into a package. And then if I move this code into another class, I can reuse that. So I can, rather than saying, here's the subroutine that you have to call, here instead is the controller class and then the method in that class that you get to call. And indeed, if I want to even say that even shorter, I can just say my controller hash hello, and Mojolicious will take that as the controller class and the method to call. So this would then allow me to write reusable controller methods to be able to display any kind of data that I want. And indeed, Yancy actually comes with one. So if I want to just display anything from my pages table, I can say use the Yancy controller, use the get action, because I'm trying to get one, and I'm going to use the pages schema. Yancy calls tables schemas. And then I'm going to use the pages template. So I haven't created this yet, but I'll create this soon. And then I want it to default to the index page. So if someone types in / and there's no ID, we're going to say ID is index, and then we'll show the index page. So I need to write the template, but before I can do that, I need to finish the app. The last line of every Mojolicious Lite application needs to be this, app start. This basically takes over control and actually runs the application. And then I can add a template. Mojolicious lets me actually put templates inside my Mojolicious application under the data key. This is actually this is a built-in Perl feature where this is the data file handle. And what Mojolicious does is it reads this file handle and looks for these little @ symbols, and then it uses that to say that this is the pages.html.ep file. And so it's called pages.html.ep because this is an HTML file, and EP stands for Embedded Perl, which is the template language that Mojolicious uses. So for this template, since I'm just showing HTML that I already have, all I have to do is show the HTML. So the controller provides this $item variable for me, and then I show its HTML column. And you'll notice I have %==. So this is a template directive for Mojolicious. The 2 equals means do not escape HTML. By default, Mojolicious really tries to prevent you from hurting yourself, and so it escapes HTML by default. And there's a lot of ways I can do that too. So I can do this with tags. So this one's just a line. The one on top is a line, and the bottom one is a tag. I can, if I want to, I can run any Perl code that I want. So I can save it off to a variable and then display that variable. Or I could even write conditionals. So the % introduces a line, but then inside, after that line, I can write any other template code that I want, and then I can close it. And if I want to, for example, show the path right above the page, I can do that too. So Mojolicious' embedded Perl templates are my favorite template ever, and I started using templates back in HTML template back in the 90s. So this is really nice. This is a lot easier to use. So that's it. That's my application. It's 99 lines, I believe, is the full. No wait, yeah, 99 lines was the full size of this application. So I can start it up just by running the myapp.perl script and then giving it the daemon argument to run the daemon. And then Mojolicious tells me it's running on port 3000, and I can visit it. Oh, right. So I haven't actually created an index page yet. So I can go do that using the Yancy editor. So if I go just to /Yancy in my site, I get to see this. And then I can add an item, and it shows me a generated form that lets me type in a path, type in some markdown. And then after I add my item, I can go back to my site, and here is my website. So that's kind of the basic Yancy website, Mojolicious Lite kind of thing. But I remember I said I wanted to add documentation. It did not look very pretty. I want to make it look pretty. And then I have to be able to deploy it to my server. So first, documentation. Mojolicious used to come with a plugin called Pod Renderer, but Sebastian deprecated it a while back, and so allowed me to fork it to Mojolicious plugin Pod Viewer. So this will render any Perl doc documentation that you tell it to. So like the Yancy module, I'm going to add a plugin. This plugin is the Pod Viewer plugin. And I want it to, by default, display the main Yancy documentation. And any other documentation that it finds, I want only to provide the Yancy documentation or the Mojolicious plugin Yancy documentation. I don't want it doing like Perl Pod or Perl Func or even Mojolicious. Displaying all that, not only displaying that documentation is kind of inappropriate for me, but it also kind of reduces the search engine optimization of other sites. So it's friendly to do that too. Any other module that's not in this list of allowed modules will get linked to MetaCpan. So by default, we go to /Perldoc and it looks like that. So that brings us to our next issue, which is making this look acceptable. And so for style, I like mostly to use the Bootstrap UI library. So I'm going to create a layout for Bootstrap. And then it's really nice to kind of have a navigation bar to get all my links. And I definitely need to make the embedded code look a little nicer. So layout templates are Mojolicious's way of sharing a bunch of, like, a common frame for all of your pages. So this is where you put things like site headers, footers, navigation, sidebars. Layout templates also allow you to have extra hooks to put things into the head. Like, for example, if you've got a single template that needs a special JavaScript, you can add that to your layout. So we're going to create a layout called default. So I'm back here in my data section. And the layouts directory is a special directory where Mojolicious finds layouts. And interestingly enough, you can have directories in your data section down here. And then since it's called default, I'll call it default.html.ep. Unfortunately, I don't have time to introduce all of how Bootstrap works, but I can show you that I'm going to use HTML5 here, so I got a doc type. And the layout template provides me the HTML tags, the head tags. And here I provide a title tag that shows the title of the page. And I can show you how to do that a little later here. And then one other thing is I always use the style sheet and the JavaScript template helpers, because these allow me to, when URLs have to be rewritten, or if I'm behind a reverse proxy, these style sheet or these helpers will actually rewrite the path so that it's correct. So here I'm just importing a style sheet that's Yancy's Bootstrap, embedded Bootstrap CSS. So it's not a common scenario to be behind a reverse proxy with a path, but it's still kind of good practice to use these helpers in case. It's difficult to diagnose the problem when you have it, I guess, is the main concern. So the main part of a layout is displaying the content. So I'm going to build a main tag. I'm going to use the Bootstrap container class, and then I'm going to say to put my content in the main tag. So this is where the internal template, that pages template I wrote before, will get put in my layout template. So if you want to have other places, like I said, to put additional content, I can use, so for in my pages, I can use content for head, and the begin tag is really fun in that it allows you to, like, bundle up a bunch of template content. So I'm going to add some JavaScript. I'm going to add view.js, and then this will go in the named section head. And then later in my layout here, I can say in the head put the head content, and of course in the body put the regular content. So now all of my templates have this kind of hook where I can say, here, this content goes in the head. If I wanted to, I could add a sidebar so that I could put, like, asides, or I can have, like, author information at the bottom of a page. And this really helps to make a flexible layout when you have to, talk back and forth between the template and the layout. So last, I wanted to create a little bit better of a code style. So I'm going to write a little bit of CSS that'll take the pre-tag, add a border, some background, a little bit of padding. If your markup is good, you can write just a little bit of CSS and make it look however you want. So be sure to write good, semantic, meaningful markup. And then, I've got a crumb trail too, and I want to make that a little bit smaller. Doesn't need to be as prominent. So next all I have to do is use that layout that I just created. So in the plugin and in my route, I just have to say, here, use the default layout. Also, if I want to, I can set the default layout for all defaults. So if I don't specify a layout otherwise, it will get the default layout. And this is how it changes. So my main page looks, well, a little bit better. But my Perl doc looks quite a bit better. And the code snippets are actually visible, and they stand out from the rest of the page. So that's how my site looks. And then now if I want to export that, I need to write it as HTML. There's a lot of ways to do that. I could just use wget mirror and then, basically scrape my own website and then upload that. But I have some specific needs. Unfortunately for me, any links that I have need to be rewritten. So any redirects that my site might make needs to be rewritten to the destination. So if I had a Mojolicious redirect, I want that to resolve into the actual page because a static site can't redirect. It doesn't have the dynamic features that way. Also, since I'll be deploying this to my website under the /Yancy folder, I need to rewrite all of the links to have that in front of it. It's a little bit more than wget mirror can handle, and I really don't want to build like an HTML parser and do all that. That just sounds bad. But Mojolicious comes with an amazing DOM library that makes this trivial. And as luck would have it, someone, me, I guess, wrote a Mojolicious command that will allow you to take any Mojolicious app and export it as a set of HTML files. So now, in addition to the daemon command that I had before, I can run the export command. So I do Perl myapp export. I tell it what the base URL is. That's that /Yancy where I'm going to deploy it later. And then I tell it where it wants to output all of the files to. So I'm going to create a directory called deploy and write all those files there. So if all you've got in your Mojolicious site is just a static kind of informational website, you're not using forms, you don't have logins, this is a really nice tool to be able to just export all that so you can upload it to somewhere else. And so to deploy it, I like using rsync. Rsync is an incredibly complex, useful tool for using SSH or other protocols to sync files from one server to another. For this purpose, I do it recursively, verbosely. I zip it to save some traffic over the wire, and I upload the modified dates so that my caching works right. I delete any files that aren't local on the remote, so if I delete a local file, it'll also be deleted on the remote host. And then I take in the local deploy directory and I'm uploading that to my document root on my website. So I highly recommend, if you haven't experienced rsync, to find a book on it. There's probably a 300 or 400 page book on it by now. And I used to use it for backups, incremental backups. It will actually create hard links and help you make incremental backups while saving as much disk space as possible. It's really incredible. But I unfortunately cannot talk about that here. So this is what it looks like. This is what the website looks like right now. I added some images there in my public folder, and Markdown for images is kind of annoying, but eventually I made it work. And that's it. So are there any questions? Yes.
You, on one slide, I think there's only one slide that was really interesting where you talked about where you can manage the schema.
Yeah.
The day store.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I thought that one of the disadvantages of SQLite is you could not do, you can't change tables. You can't do alter tables.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe it's limited support for that.
Maybe there may be limited support. So yeah, the question is, does SQLite support alter table? And I believe I've used it. It's quite possible that maybe it doesn't, but then what you could do in the migration is you could create a new temporary table, load all your insert from, select from, basically build your new table and then rename it, or
You could do all that in that.
yeah, because it's just a SQL script. Those are just essentially saved SQL snippets, and you can say to up is copy the data somewhere else, create the new table, and load the data back, and then delete the old table.
And is exactly how that works, is that we do that. And in fact, in like MySQL, when you run an alter table statement, in many cases under the hood, that's what it's actually doing. It's creating a new table and then renaming it.
Yeah. So basically, like the SQL syntax is essentially shorthand for that.
And does that tool work with other data stores as well?
Yeah. So that's it's a feature of all the Mojolicious drivers.
Okay.
So Mojo SQLite is a driver. Mojo MySQL, and Mojo PG for Postgres. SQLite doesn't, the DBI module for SQLite doesn't support async. So Mojo SQLite isn't as amazing as Mojo MySQL and Mojo Postgres because those support asynchronous operations, and you can get a little more efficiency out of that. So that's why you might use the Mojo module over DBI or DBIX class. Any other questions, comments, concerns, scathing rebuttal, bombastic praise? All right, so since I wrote this talk a year ago, I've got a couple minutes here at least.
Yeah, you're just past halfway.
Oh, that did not take as long as I thought. Last time I gave this talk was 6 or 8 months ago at the Chicago Perl Mongers, and apparently we had a lot more digression. So since I wrote this talk, however, I decided that, you know what, actually it'd be kind of nice if I could write my website as a bunch of markdown files on the file system like, all the kids are doing. And so I created a database for Yancy, which ends up being, one of those flat file databases that everyone likes creating. Called Yancy Backend Static. And so rather than loading rows into a SQLite database, I get to create markdown files with the front matter, the YAML front matter, like Hugo and what's the other one? Ruby, Jekyll. Yes, Jekyll. Jekyll, I guess, invented this, as far as I know. But so you put all your metadata up on the top here, and then you put your markdown in the middle, or on the bottom, and then the static backend will render that markdown into HTML and present that to Yancy, so that I tell it to use the static backend. I give it the home directory of the application, and it just kind of works. Indeed, I can then run my app. I can go into Yancy. I can edit the markdown, and then it gets updated on the file system. So essentially what I've built then is a static site generator that also allows me to edit it from inside the daemon. And this is, I mentioned that I wrote a static site generator before. This is kind of the next step in that. I'm going to rebuild it so that it uses this under the hood, which ought to be pretty interesting if I ever get it to work. So that's all I have. So thank you very much. Yeah.
What's your take? Mojolicious is one of the two big packages on the website. Catalyst being the other.
Also Dancer. Don't forget Dancer.
Okay.
Sorry.
And Dancer. Is there any value in porting this over to one of those tools, or is there a reason that you picked this one, or is it just the first one that you have the most experience with?
So is there any value in making Yancy for something like this for another web framework? I could see the value to those other web frameworks. I believe Catalyst, has RapidApp, or rather RapidApp uses Catalyst. So that's kind of a similar, I guess. I noticed a lot of parallels after the fact. I noticed a lot of parallels between what I was doing and what RapidApp has been doing for a long time. Dancer, I don't know it well enough, like it'd be possible, but Mojolicious especially is so Mojolicious is asynchronous, like from the core. So it allows me to do like WebSockets very easily, always. So that's generally why I kind of started using Mojolicious, and then yeah, and that's kind of why I built it using Mojolicious. I don't know Dancer well enough to say whether or not it'd be trivial or non-trivial to be able to port something like this. It probably wouldn't be too bad. The JavaScript app that I wrote, the editor, mostly uses an open API. So actually, the JavaScript apps builds like a schema spec that it then uses to know, these are the rows, or these are the fields in this table. So the JavaScript part of it could probably be ported to a different web framework. You just have to basically build that API layer, that those routes in that other web framework. Yeah, it wouldn't be, I guess, too onerous. I don't know if you'd get all the fun, interesting features like configurable controllers, and indeed, like the next steps of Yancy is where you can create a controller that allows you to do multi-tenancy. So you, as part of your path, you add a username, and then Yancy sees that, okay, this is the username and this is the ID. We look for this row with this username and this ID, and if it doesn't exist under that username, well, then it's not that user's content. And so you can allow a user just to edit their own content by building a new controller that you say, here's where the username is in the path. Like I want to build a calendar controller that says, here's the date, and then provide to me the list of the list of weeks, the list of days. You probably can do all that stuff. I believe. I don't know if Dancer MVC, or sorry, Catalyst is MVC. You can definitely do it there. Migrating this to Catalyst wouldn't be terrible, but I couldn't tell you about Dancer. Sorry.
You mentioned that you have your content stored in a markdown field, and then you have automatic logic to render that generated HTML into that HTML field. And you mentioned that you're using JavaScript to do that. So what point are you doing that? Are you doing that on the fly on the front end when the page is requested, then you cache it? How do you detect when a change is happening to the markdown field to then re-render the HTML?
All right, so yeah, so the question is, how do I, in JavaScript, how do I take the markdown and make it into HTML? And actually, that is handled by, so I use Vue, the Vue.js JavaScript app framework. And so, yeah, Vue sees the text area for the markdown change, and then, yeah, it runs marked. MARKED is the markdown library that I'm using. It runs the marked.markdown and renders it right to the HTML. So essentially, it's per keystroke. Every time you touch a keystroke.
You're writing per keystroke to that HTML column?
To the not to the back end, but in like basically the HTML and the markdown are updating simultaneously as you're typing it, and then when you hit save, then it goes back to the database. So yeah, basically everything happens in the front end until you hit save.
When you reload it later, does it pull from the HTML or does it re-render from the markdown?
It pulls from the HTML. So that's so you don't have to load a markdown library.
Do you have any logic to text when if that's changed, if it's not changed through the one interface?
No, that's yeah. If you change the markdown not through the editor, you'd have to update that yourself, and it's a limitation. Yeah, and that's also why the Yancy backend static it needs a markdown render itself, so that will actually install text markdown, and it's not the best markdown library, but it's the best one for Perl. There is a common mark library for Perl, but it uses the lib common mark, which means you need a C compiler, and that's annoying. I did try to start building a Mojo DOM based common mark parser, but I haven't got to finish it yet, and that'd be really nice to have a pure Perl common mark.
Yeah, that's something that's missing, and if you want to collaborate on that type of thing, I would talk to me after.
Yeah.
Because I came to the same conclusion when I worked on this stuff, is that you can't not generate the HTML and
Yeah.
The only viable option is to use a front-end JavaScript.
Yeah, text Markdown is not bad. That's what I've been using for statically. It's a little bit slow,
But it's
but
not enough, and it doesn't support GitHub flavored Markdown. And
right.
modern
Yeah,
Markdown.
text Markdown doesn't support the modern, I guess, changes to Markdown. It's definitely the original Markdown. Any other questions about Mojolicious in general, even? All right. Thank you very much.